Before we dive deeply into JavaScript, let's go ahead and discuss JavaScript's syntax. In other words, the characters, the special symbols, and the reserved words that we use in order to communicate in our code to the JavaScript execution environment what we want it to do, what we want it to ignore, when we start statements and when we end statements, and when we begin special procedures in the language. Let's begin with comments. So traditionally, it's important that we write our code as self-explanatory as possible. In other words, we want our code to be self-describing. We don't want it to be super complex and hard to interpret or understand by the people who will end up taking care of our code, because we are not always going to be the one who takes care of our code all the way through its entire life cycle. We're going to have other developers working with us on our code and developers taking over our code. So when we run into situations where we cannot make our code self-explanatory, we need to make sure that we comment it. There are two different ways to add comments to your JavaScript source code. The first one you see here, I've already got them laid out, is the double slash. The double forward slash lets the execution environment know that these are comments, these are here for humans, they're not here for the computer nor for the JavaScript execution environment, and can safely be ignored when the JavaScript is being executed. A second way to add comments is what we call a multi-line comment, which is going to be the forward slash, asterisk, asterisk, forward slash, and within those, we go ahead and we add any content that we want on multiple, or that will span across multiple lines. So, and this is a multi-line comment. We can use it to write long comments to help others understand our code. All right, so that's a multi-line comment. So really those are the two comments that you're going to use the most frequently. I tend to use the single line // comments more than I use the /* comments. If you're running into these a lot in your code, that probably means you're writing your code way too complex and or you are not making it understandable by default. You should probably re-examine that code and make sure that you are making it as easy to understand as possible. The other important part are reserved words. So reserved words are actual words or groups of characters that are defined in the language as having a special meaning. In other words, anytime the JavaScript execution environment runs into this word, it will interpret that word to mean a very specific task or thing it should do, a very specific execution. For example, if we run into var, var means, hey, interpreter, we're getting ready to create a variable, and so we need some memory where we can stuff some data. So when the interpreter runs into var and then a word after it, my name, and then an equals sign, and then something like that, what's happening here is the interpreter is running down the code and from left to right. And when it runs into var, it sees that it is a reserved word. In other words, this is not a word made up by the developer. This is a word that has a very specific meaning. And the meaning in JavaScript is, let's create a variable. And so the interpreter or the execution environment knows that at that point, it needs to run to the computer, it needs to ask for a block of memory in preparation for creating a variable that the programmer is inevitably going to put some data in. And so it'll go collect some memory, get a memory address from the computer, and then immediately after that, it'll see a statement that I made, which is not a reserved word. I made this up. It's called my name. And this is the human readable name that I am going to give to the memory address where my data is going to be stored. The address for memory that actually comes back when this command gets executed is like a whole bunch of numbers and letters and is impossible for me to remember, and it's dynamic. It's real time as it gets executed, which means I don't know it before I wrote my program, right? Before the program executes. So for that, I need a temporary human readable name that can refer to the address that this command got back for me. So to make it simple, var says to the JavaScript execution environment, go get me some memory, get me an address. I will refer to that memory address using my own custom name that I can remember. And then using the assignment operator, which is the equals sign, I am then going to stuff this string into that memory. So var creates buckets for us to put stuff in for use throughout our program. All right, so var is an example of a reserved word. Let my last name let is also an example, and it does a very similar process to var. It says, hey, go get me a memory space. I'm going to go ahead and refer to that memory space with my own custom human readable name, and let stuff Clark in it for use later. So let does the same thing. Const is also one, and let's just say that const is a container, just like these other two, that once we get the memory address back, it can no longer change once it has data stuffed into it. So never changing data equals 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's say that 1, 2, 3, 4 is super important in my program. It never changes. I'm always doing some kind of calculation against 1, 2, 3, 4, and I don't ever want it to change in my program. So const, that reserved word, is saying, hey, go get me a space in memory. I'm going to refer to it by this name that's human readable, and let's put 1, 2, 3, 4 in it. But JavaScript, don't ever let the value that's held in that memory space be changed by anyone at any time. So those are some examples of reserved words. Now there are a lot more reserved words in the JavaScript language, and I'll leave that as a task to you to go learn about the additional reserved words that allow you to have a lot of functionality in JavaScript without writing it yourself. So reserved words, super important. Now let's talk about brackets. You're going to run into brackets all over the place. So var my toys equals, right here, you will learn, if you haven't already, that the square brackets pretty much tells JavaScript, let's go ahead and create an array. And we can make an array of various items. So right here, I'm making an array of toys. And so this right here is telling JavaScript, like we said before, go get me memory address to put stuff in. Let's go ahead and refer to it as this. And then this is the data that gets stuffed into it. Well, the square bracket right here says, hey, JavaScript, get ready. We're creating an array literal. So we're literally creating an array. Get ready to do that, and then it will then set up everything it needs in order to begin creating an array full of data. And so right here we're saying create an array, and then it creates an array and stuffs in these two strings into that array. So square brackets, you're going to run into those all the time because we use arrays a ton. You're going to run into curly braces. So when you are creating you're creating functions, you're going to run into curly braces as well as parentheses. So right here, function, another keyword, it tells JavaScript, hey, get ready, we're going to create a function or an operation that we're going to want to refer to by this name, and inside of the parentheses, we're going to be looking for some kind of parameter. So you can define parameters, and we'll leave that to the discussion about functions. But right here, the parentheses imply that there's going to be a parameter accepted into this function. And then you've got the curly braces. The curly braces tell the JavaScript execution environment that anything wrapped in the opening and closing curly braces are going to be the lines of code or the statements that are to be executed when this function gets called. So in here, we're going to find code that will get executed when we call this function, and it will use anything that we pass in inside the parentheses. The other things you're going to run into are the punctuation. So as we've already seen here, the semicolon actually tells the JavaScript execution environment or the interpreter that we are done with that statement. There's no further code that needs to be executed as part of that statement. So go ahead and execute the commands as requested. So in all reality, the interpreter will read all of this, and it's not until it runs into the semicolon that it will then go and actually execute the entire statement, which means it'll go get some memory, assign this name to that memory address so that we can remember and we can refer back to it, and then build and stuff this array into that memory location or reference to it. That all doesn't happen until it reaches that semicolon. In other words, the semicolon is super important because it tells JavaScript, let's go execute it. Other symbols that you're going to run into are punctuation, such as the single quotes, which defines a string literal, or literally defines a string, and that's why they're called string literals. And then the double quotes, that defines another type of string, and we'll leave that to another discussion to define the difference between the two. But you will run into the double quotes and the single quotes all the time in your JavaScript code. So that's the basic syntax around JavaScript. So if you can remember all of those, you're 90% of the way there when it comes to syntax. And then as you program more and more, you'll learn additional syntax that becomes important in your programming.